Hospitalized and Teleportation, an LSD and mushrooms trip report, posted by Annan to Erowid.org, February 8th, 2013. Age 19. Date October 10th, 2011. Dose 7 grams of mushrooms and 4 hits of LSD. I'd done LSD twice prior to this experience, and mushrooms 3 times. I'd also tripped quite a lot on 2CE, as well as salvia, and considered myself moderately experienced with psychedelics. I'd never tripped very deep, even with up to 75 milligrams of 2CE. I was very eager to get a really deep, meaningful experience. I'd heard that tripping alone would allow your mind to really let go, to not have someone there with you to ground you in reality. Well, from my experience, that's completely true. It was the day before Thanksgiving, and I'd just bought 7 grams of mushrooms and 4 hits of LSD from a friend. I don't really know why I decided to trip that night. It was one of the worst times I could have done it, being the day before Thanksgiving with lots of stuff to do the next day with family. I initially was only going to do it at 9 PM, but I kept putting it off and telling myself, it's not a good time, just wait till next week. But by 11 PM, I decided, fuck it, and took my 7 grams of mushrooms and ground them into a powder. I used them to brew a mushroom tea. I then flavoured it with orange juice and sugar, and it tasted pretty good. Whilst I was drinking my brew, I took the 4 hits of LSD. Within 15 minutes I could feel my stomach twisting and turning, bubbling on the inside. The mushrooms were at work alright, and at the 30-minute mark I could see the classic mushroom visuals. I looked at my cement floor, a liquid texture. It looked like a bowl of soup. I had never seen visuals this loose before. I shook my head and the world jiggled like a bowl of jello. I spent the next 15 minutes looking at items around my room and shaking my head. I decided to put on some psytrance to get myself in the right mindset. At the 45-minute mark, it was only getting more intense. My visuals had taken on a pink and purple hue. I turned off the lights because it was starting to bother me. The colours weren't as noticeable in the dark, but I found it almost impossible to see anything but my TV or computer screen. My vision was polluted with a fuzzy texture, much like that of static on a TV. I spent the next 10 minutes or so trying to get comfortable and fighting the worsening stomach pains. At about an hour in, it felt like the LSD was finally starting to take effect. My trip briefly took on a much lighter, happier feeling. I turned the lights back on and decided to play my guitar. I felt like I was playing some really beautiful stuff, but it was probably just the drugs. This whole time I was still trying to fight the stomach pains, but they were just getting worse and worse. When, finally, I had had enough, and had to run for a bucket I kept just in case something like this happened. I puked 3 or 4 times, but it was strange. Usually when I puke it's very watery, a large amount, and I won't puke more than once. But this was different. I was puking up very small amounts and it was all grey mush. It kind of weirded me out because I just drank that tea, so why wasn't any water coming out? This sent me into a bad mindset, like something was wrong with me. I stumbled over to my bed to lay down and try to feel better, but I noticed that everything, and I mean everything, was moving. Usually when I trip, I'll see things move or scurry along in the corner of my eyes, but this stuff was happening right in the centre of my vision. I didn't like that at all. It's like my trip intensified 10 times after I'd puked. I got into bed with colours flying all over the walls. I felt things crawling up my legs, but reasoned with myself that it was just my sheets. I tried to keep calm and ride it out, telling myself that fighting it will only make things worse. I knew I was in this for at least 6 hours, so I tried my best to bring myself back to a happy place, but it wasn't working. All I could think about is, what have you done to yourself? Why did you do this the night before Thanksgiving? What kind of a drugged out loser does this kind of shit to themselves? It was just an endless cycle of thoughts like that. I jump out of bed and run to my computer. I go to Google and type in how to stop an LSD trip, please help me. I can't even read the words on the screen. I don't know what happened. Maybe it's because I was in such a panic at the time, but I have no clue. It just made no sense to me why I couldn't read simple English words. I'd been able to read them my whole life, and now all of a sudden, I'm no longer literate. At this point, I genuinely thought I'd lost my mind. I was convinced I'd gone too far and had permanently wrecked my mind with the drugs I had taken. My mind then filled with the voices of my friends and family saying things like, "I told you this would happen. Why would you do this, you idiot? You're fucked now." I began to picture myself in a mental institution, locked away from all of society. My name and face was in the paper with the headline, "Local teen perma-fried." I tried my best to keep my mind off this topic, telling myself everything will be fine, that it's just a drug, and when it wears off I'll be back to normal. But in the back of my mind, I knew I was lying to myself. I spent what felt like hours trying to calm down. I browsed my favourite sites, Justin.tv and YouTube, and then opened up a stream on Justin.tv and saw a guy playing some sort of really fucked up computer game. Everyone was half naked and having sex, and there were random things bouncing around. It was nothing that looked familiar to me, and this really freaked me out, because I didn't know if this was real or if I was just imagining it. I looked at the stream's chat and everybody was extremely negative, saying things like, "Go kill yourself, faggot." This really got to me. I kept picturing myself slitting my arms and chopping off my fingers, and I just could not get it out of my head. I was really worried I would actually do the stuff I was thinking. So much so, I had to go grab a pen and paper and write down, "Do not hurt yourself." It seemed to help, so I stuck it in front of my screen so that I couldn't look away from it. I went back to looking up how to stop my trip, even though I knew there was nothing I could realistically do about it. I guess I got some sort of comfort out of trying. My thoughts only got worse and worse. I was still convinced I had lost my mind, that there was no coming back from it, and that it was not safe for me to be alone, as I might hurt myself for whatever reason. I was pacing back and forth in my room for at least 15 minutes just talking to myself. I looked at my clock, and it was only 12:45 AM. This blew my fucking mind, because I thought it would be at least 3 AM. This really discouraged me. I knew I was going to be tripping for a very long time, and if it was going this slow, it was going to be a nightmare for sure. The same process repeated itself. Me thinking I'd lost my mind, pacing in my room, telling myself I'd be okay, but actually thinking the complete opposite of that. It was now 1:30 AM, and I had had enough of this. I decided my only option was to go outside. My reasoning was that nature would calm me down. I'd be okay once I was away from my room. In my state, I couldn't really feel my body all that well. I was constantly on tippy toes and flexing my muscles. The very idea of going outside and being okay sparked something in my mind, and aside to feel better, no, I felt amazing in fact. I was in a godlike state now. I was untouchable. I sprinted upstairs barefoot and in pyjama pants. I decided to leave my shoes because I simply didn't need such things. Why would someone who is untouchable need a shoes to protect their feet or a jacket to keep them warm? In my mind, I pictured mountain lions ripping at my flesh, me laying on the ground unaffected, immortal. I felt such a rush of power, like nothing I'd ever felt before. Something stimulants and other drugs simply couldn't even touch. I wrote a letter to my family telling them exactly what I had taken and what had happened. I told them I would leave them in peace for Thanksgiving, and that I was sorry I had done this. My plan was to leave the house and go somewhere for 24 hours to see if I'd lost my mind or not. If I did, I would live the rest of my life in isolation. I know how stupid that is, but that's honestly what I thought my options were at the time. I got outside. It was dark, but I could see just fine. Colours filled my vision. I live in a quiet little neighbourhood, mostly older couples with very young children. There's a railroad behind my house that passes through a forested area. I decided I would head for that. I was walking very slowly like a cat burglar. I could feel the cold cement against my feet with every step, and it felt amazing. The feeling rippled through my legs and out of my fingers. I was one with the ground I was walking on, and I got to the fence and jumped over it with ease. I had the prowess of a tiger, and felt like I could do just about anything. I finally got to the forest and found a small clearing where I sat down cross-legged. I stared at the sky and the trees and felt the wind on my face. This is amazing. All my senses were boosted. Sight, smell, sound, touch, and taste. I cleared my mind and closed my eyes. I saw picture-perfect images of anything I wanted. I could think of something, and there it was. It was astonishing. I had never experienced anything like this before, and wanted to tell the world just how amazing it really was. I thought about running to my friend's house and waking him up to tell him about my experience, but quickly realised just how bad of an idea that really was. I then realised I had left a note to my family describing in great detail what I had done. Oh shit, I need to get home. I shouldn't be outside in my pyjamas with no shoes on in the fucking forest of all places. I jump up and run home. I don't know how long I spent in that forest, but it was starting to get light out now. I get home to find my mother there. She's read my letter and actually isn't reacting all that badly. She's mad, of course, that I left the house and tells me how stupid and dangerous it was to go out in such a state. But I'm honestly amazed that she isn't freaking out right now. Images of my childhood flash in my head. Me as a baby, as a child at the zoo. My mother caring for me. I'm flooded with these emotions and mostly the feeling of love. I tell my mum I love her and give her a big hug. The next 30 minutes or so is spent sitting on the couch talking to my mother. I'm ranting about how money isn't real and about how we just choose to believe in it, as well as time not being real either. It's all just an illusion. Everything in the world is love. We are all connected. We are all just a mass spirit system. Death is nothing. It was at this point my mum is starting to get freaked out. I thought our conversation was going great, but she's starting to see just how far gone I really am. My stepdad wakes up, and this is where it starts to get bad. He storms downstairs and my mum tells him what I've done. I can see it in his face. Pure disgust. I can see him judging me, wishing I wasn't around. I can hear it in his tone as he talks to me. It eats away at me like maggots on a corpse. I try to put it at the back of my mind, turn on the TV and flip through the channels. But at that moment, something switched in my mind. I unlocked something. Just like the TV changing channels, so could my mind. So that's what I did. I closed my eyes and flipped channels. I opened my eyes and I was somewhere else. It was unreal. I never even imagined this could happen. I had read and heard about people tripping and seeing full-on hallucinations, but thought they might be exaggerating. Nah, this was real. I was teleporting all around the world with the bat of an eyelash. While I was doing this, apparently my eyes had rolled back in my head and I'd fallen to the ground. I don't remember any of this. I was just teleporting to different places all over the world and having a wonderful time. I switched channels back to reality and see my mum holding me and singing Amazing Grace. This sort of chanting puts me into an almost shamanic trance. Her voice multiplied in my head and took over everything. I could hear a high-pitched chime in the background that got louder and louder and eventually broke my mind. It's really hard to explain, but that's honestly the best way I can describe it. Now, everything is quiet. My mum is saying things like, "Okay, just be quiet, you'll be alright." Try to be quiet, but something really isn't right. I have a feeling of pure anger and hatred inside of me. I'm seeing blown up babies, burnt women and children, chopped up people, rapes, wars. Everything bad in the world is coming at me right now. I can feel the pain of every human being on this planet. I'm reminded of what I learnt about Buddhism, the noble truth that life means suffering. I am overwhelmed at this point. I don't have my eyes open, and I don't remember much, but I'm told that I flung myself onto the table where I landed onto a drinking glass and smashed it. This really scares me, because that honestly could have killed me. But luckily, I didn't get cut by the glass. This is really out of the ordinary, because up until this point, I've never been out of control like this. Not even overly drunk. I'm usually very good at that. Well, my stepdad had had enough of this, and he phones the paramedics to come and get me. On the phone, I guess they heard me screaming in the background, and because of that, I had to bring the police as well. Well, I had no idea this was happening, so out of nowhere, a bunch of cops and paramedics walk in, and it's just the ultimate mindfuck in that moment. I cannot describe what I felt at this time. It was basically a confirmation that everything I was experiencing was just in my mind, because why else would a bunch of cops and paramedics be in my house? With this knowledge that it was all a dream and I was really not in any trouble at all, I felt fucking fantastic once again. Now it was all a game. I'd unlocked some sort of cheat code from my mind. They strapped me to the trolley and wheeled me out to the ambulance. I remember the ride in the trolley. It was unreal. I felt like I was dead. Like I was a corpse in a coffin being carried to their grave. Inside the ambulance, I was just fucking with them because I thought it wasn't real. I kept asking them where we were going. Obviously not the hospital, because this was in my mind. In that moment, I was convinced we were going to Egypt, and I was so excited. I've always wanted to see Egypt. I told them all how amazing it was going to be, and how I couldn't wait till we got there. They played along, and told me we'd get there soon. Now I'm in the hospital, and I realise I have cuffs on. Not only that, but they are really tight and hurt. Quickly, I see that this is real, and I'm handcuffed, naked, and tied to a bed. What happened to me? I quickly changed my tone from happy-go-lucky to what the fuck is going on? The nurses don't pay much attention to me. They say the cuffs are for my safety. I plead with them and tell them how I would never hurt anyone, and this continues for quite a long time. They stick a urinary catheter in me, ouch, and pump something into my blood with an IV, which makes me feel like shit. I'm so tired, my muscles ache, and I can't even sleep. I'm also tripping really hard still. I can see waves of colour flowing across the hospital sheets and morphing on the walls. My mum and stepdad come to see me. They're really shaken and tell me what I've done. I'm extremely embarrassed and sorry that this happened. I'm told I have to talk to a psychologist before I'm allowed to leave. We talk and everything checks out. I then leave at 7 AM. I got absolutely no sleep that day and stayed up to eat dinner with the family. We don't tell anyone what happened. Only my mum and stepdad know. It hurts when I lift my arms. I have deep purple bruises all over them, as well as my neck, ribs, back and stomach. I have not touched any psychedelics since that experience, and doubt I will for a very long time. It really opened my eyes. I thought I knew what I was getting into, but I really didn't. I made lots and lots of mistakes that night. Number one being taking it the day I did. I was not in the right mindset, and it was almost 100% that it would turn into a bad trip. Second mistake was tripping alone. I think if I had a friend with me, this could have all been avoided. My parents didn't know about my drug use before this either. They thought I only smoked pot once a week. I told them I only took 2 hits of acid, and it was my first time doing it. I've only told one of my friends about this experience, and don't plan on telling anyone else because, well, it's pretty embarrassing. I guess I'm just posting this because it's an interesting story. It's nice to get it off my chest and talk about it, you know. If you read this whole thing, and bravo. Right, I just wanted to clarify things before we jump into this report, because I guarantee there's going to be comments where people say, "Oh, this report is fake as fuck, unsubbed." So, for me, there's probably 3 explanations for what went on here. The first is that the woman experienced cocaine psychosis after abusing the stimulant for, say, days on end, which actually is more attributed to the lack of sleep that comes with abusing stimulants like coke. The second is that it could have been one of these psychedelic stimulants that they got sold as cocaine. It could have been DOB, DOC. If you look them up, it's possible to actually hallucinate things on them because they're more hallucinogenic. And the third explanation, however the least likely in my opinion, is that this actually was cocaine, and that the woman herself, she describes that she has past experience with tulpas, so she's obviously quite a mystical, spiritual person. I don't know what she's doing, abusing cocaine to induce these visions, but whatever, you do you. That she's some form of genetic outcast and can actually induce these types of experiences through stimulants. I have no idea, but regardless, this is a really interesting report, and I know you guys love anything to do with entities, so we'll jump right in. Open-eyed entity hallucination. A cocaine trip report by Gebula. Posted to earwig.org, April 28, 2022. This was a 5-minute, stable, highly interactive, open-eyed entity hallucination that I narrated to my friend in National Geographic style detail. Physical contact was felt. It was very strange that what was advertised as cocaine caused this, but I don't think many people make any kind of an attempt to hallucinate beings on cocaine in the first place, whereas I did, using past experiences with tulpas. Check them out on Wikipedia. So take that as you will. This cocaine was tested with a fentanyl test strip and came up negative. The main being I will focus on describing here was a spider that was exploring around me on my bed, and at some points, even crawling onto my friend and onto me. It would change size and build slightly at times, and range from roughly quarter-sized to rat-sized. It moved its legs in this very cute, scrambling, goofy and expressive way that looked distinctly cartoon-like and benign. Despite an overwhelming majority of positivity, there were 2 distinct times at which the spider being developed a piercing mouthpart, along with a mosquito-like body, and it kind of pumped the mouthpart in and out of my friend's back. Then later, through a seam of my pant leg, it put up a considerable, funny struggle to get through the seam. I had the sense that this piercing was bad, and as an afterthought, should have shooed them away gently when they attempted to insert. But it was acting so disarming before and after that I didn't act. I only watched, letting them either inject something or suck something out. I'm really not sure which. I'll break down the experience into a few portions. Number 1. My technique for seeing it, quality of the visual. I first sensed the spider by defocusing from any physical thing in the room and staring into the open space in front of me and around the periphery of my vision. The visual first manifested as a sense of disembodied movement, and then as I tracked the movement, I detected a type of wavy air outline that looked somewhat like how you can see heat rising from a well-sunned road. It also reminded me of very thin ice. It was very much see-through with no colour, but with small ripples and distortions. The spider being was constantly moving, and the movement made it much easier to see. Number 2. A physical sensation from entity contact. At one point, the spider entity was crawling along my arm towards my hand. I raised my hand up slowly and pointed my index finger upward. The entity crawled up and perched on top of my finger, and kind of bounced or stomped its legs. Honestly, it was unclear exactly what it did. However, I felt a clear tingling and pressure on the top of that finger, like weight. This was truly a breakthrough moment for me. I was overjoyed. Yet during the phase when the mosquito-formed spider was inserting its mouthpart into my friend and I, neither of us felt any sensations, which to be honest I'm thankful for, because that would have been extra disturbing. Number 3. The being transformed. When the spider had finished inserting its mouthpart into my friend's back, it continued to crawl around on her with, again, an exploring, curious attitude very clearly communicated by the leg movements. I then experimentally brought my index finger close to it, and it quickly became highly aware of me and very amusingly reached out with a few of its front legs and eagerly rocked them back and forth, waving them excitedly and straining intently for my finger. It clearly wanted contact. I brought my finger closer and it got more excited, but I didn't touch it. Then, after several more moments of leg waving, almost as if a result of it giving up trying to reach me, it transformed into a small sphere made of the same immaterial wavy air that I described previously, which then expanded until it contacted my hand and began to balloon around it. This moment was interesting because I would half expect the substance to be able to pass through my hand, yet my hand left impressions in it. I removed my hand from the bubble's way and it continued to expand until it was about hula hoop size. And then it dissipated, or something along those lines. I've lost that moment now, unfortunately. Number 4. Perception of colour. At one point towards the end of the hallucination, the spider began to quickly create webs. One was created connecting my outstretched arm to the nearby wall. As I stared at the web, I noticed a faint bluish colour extending from the centre of the web in a rough circle with edges that slowly fluctuated in different distances from the centre. This fluctuating bluish blob had a very similar look to the lava lamp-like blue blobs I see during the hypnagogic, sleep-entering state behind my eyelids. An additional detail was that the spider was constructing the web, but at the same time part of it, the circular part connecting each radial strand. It then began to construct itself with a single extending strand, bouncing very cartoonishly in this happy way from one radial strand to another. Number 5. An additional entity. Right before I decided to stop tracking the movements of these beings and move on with the physical world activities, as I was a little concerned they would get too interesting and get in the way of my, albeit minimal, duties, I perceived another entity made of the same stuff as before, that looked to be veiled and a little taller than a human that was standing near the edge of the bed. I wasn't sure whether it was friend or foe, so I asked it aloud. It then reached up an arm and doffed a bowler hat that appeared on its head, which was at the point where I had to wrap things up. I then focused on my friend, and when I looked back at where the entity was, it was gone. Number 6. How I was able to remember as much detail as I did. I may not have been able to recall as much, or be as calm had my friend not been there to ground me. I got her okay to narrate the activities of the entities, so I was speaking aloud to her while they were doing the thing. This helped a lot, and I got the feeling that the better I was able to describe their activities, the slightly more visible they became. I had some very open, heartfelt conversations with this friend beforehand, and she was familiar with tripping, so I felt at ease to openly describe the activities of the being so without being judged. She was also very tired, almost sleeping at the time, which grounded my excitability at what was happening and gave me an important degree of composure. If I had been alone, some fear might have gotten a foothold. Number 7. Going forward. In the future, if this happens while I'm alone, I will use my phone to record my narration and ground my experience. I'm kind of pissed that I didn't do this from the get-go though, but I wasn't expecting to see anything at all, and I was worried that if I fiddled with my phone, I'd extinguish the hallucination. If I could suggest anything as an aid to navigating entity hallucinations from this and past experiences, it would be to narrate aloud what is going on in a detailed way. Also, don't assume that what you're narrating about can't hear you. You may need to address a being directly at some points, or perhaps the whole way through. There were some points where I switched to speaking aloud to the human-like entity, and my friend thought I was addressing her. I think removing as much confusion as possible over what you're going to do and say is important to correct entity hallucination navigation. Thank you all for reading. An 800 microgram trip report, posted to the LSD subreddit 2 years ago by the user Giftwilling. I'm still tripping pretty hard. I took this at 8 PM, and as I'm writing this, it's 3:26 AM. For those interested in the details, anyone that sees my post history will know I'm a seasoned psychonaut, and know that I'm not bluffing about dosage or the things I'm about to share. 8D music is absolutely insane to listen to at this dose. It was like being at a super crisp clear concert. It was like my consciousness was a 3D sound wave, and I became this sphere of sound. The sound was absolutely insane, and that was with regular AirPods. For you guys wondering, I swear to God the visuals for the first 3 hours were overwhelming. An hour in, and the sacred floral patterns were so overwhelming I couldn't see my hands anymore. It's incredibly beautiful and divine, however. The patterns and sacred geometry are overwhelming at peak. It's almost some DMT level stuff. A beautiful, terrifying sight to say the least. It can be extremely confusing as to what you're seeing or what's going on. Your reality is incredibly fractalized, whether your eyes are opened or closed. The peak was absolutely terrifying. Things got extremely weird and ego dissolution was unavoidable, as expected at this dose. I remember stumbling into my bedroom and getting down on my knees and thinking to myself that I was grateful to experience life and have a consciousness in the first place. It was by now that the sacred geometry and fractals were extremely overwhelming. Sounds were melting together, and my body felt nearly non-existent. I got this visual of a feathered creature with eyes all over the wings. This creature was gargantuan in size. It literally spanned miles and miles, and there were millions, if not billions, of eyes. I had seen biblically accurate angels before, so this wasn't necessarily deviant. However, this one that appeared didn't have the same divine presence I was used to feeling with other angels, such as the wheels within wheel or Ophanim angels I saw in 400 micrograms. Or a beautiful 6-winged seraphim I saw in 1300 micrograms. This one was different though. It started giving me all this knowledge. At that point in time, I literally knew everything and anything. It was crazy. The answers weren't what I thought they were, and it was insanely surreal. I was everything and knew all of existence. I was amazed at how this being was able to give me so much information at once. We started talking, but the conversation became insanely weird. I can't even recall what they were about, but we discussed these super abstract philosophical concepts, literally conversations beyond any fathomable concepts any man could conceive. I don't even remember how the conversation went verbatim. I just remembered this all ending with the feathered creature telling me all this could be mine if I accepted I was God. I told him I wasn't God, and he argued back several reasons why I was. He started to become aggressive, and after I rejected his proposal, he literally spent what felt like literal eons torturing me, going through every single bad thing I had done in my lifetime, and mentally tormenting me about it. I literally remember looking at the time on my phone, which said 10:27, and this pathetic demon or Satan himself was dragging me back into this timeless eternal hell of torture, keeping me trapped in this timeless mental loop pit. I was literally stuck here for a literal decade, if not centuries. I'm not even exaggerating here. I was hyper aware of everything that was happening. Every single moment, every second between a second, this evil demon tortured me for every sin I had committed. It told me in the most intricate ways how I couldn't be forgiven and there was no way out. I looked up again to see only 1 minute had passed. It was 10:28. I'd taken this 800 microgram dosage with a few close friends and girlfriend in our apartment. We were all intoxicated, but I was the only one on LSD. While all of this was happening, I appeared normal to everyone that was there. They only perceived me as staring off into space occasionally before regrouping with them to continue our conversation. Under the surface, I was fighting this interdimensional mental battle with this satanic being that was abusing me forever. After what felt like ages, it eventually left me alone, angry that I didn't want to accept its teachings. The rest of the trip was incredibly pleasant, I must say, and the come down was a great reliever to that hell-like peak I'd just been through. I had an amazing time with everyone that was over that night. 9 hours in, I still have involuntary synesthesia. My body feels like it has very undefined boundaries at times. Those that trip will know what I'm talking about. I'd say at the moment, 4:18 AM, my come down looks a lot like what a 300 microgram peak would look like. I will say that I made a huge mistake treating 800 micrograms as a recreational dose with friends around. But I must say that while the set and the people that here tonight were amazing, this was definitely the wrong setting. Everyone was getting fucked up and high, and I took this drug having the let's get high mentality instead of my more cautious outlook with acid that I normally use. While some moments were incredibly euphoric and heavenly, I had a scary peak that taught me a lot more about this substance that I thought I already knew everything about. I went in a bit overconfident and cocky, thinking since I had a dozen trips, including a 7-gram APE trip under my belt, and acid trips ranging up to 400 micrograms, that I could probably handle my shit at 800. I'd taken an accidental outlier dose of liquid LSD at 1300 micrograms that was actually super incredible and positive. That's what initially made me want to explore and map the territory I missed between 400 and 1300. So initially I didn't think there was harm at starting somewhere approximately in the middle. As stated earlier, while on the surface I appeared as a normal person, or as normal as someone can appear while high as fuck tripping, there was so much going on internally. I now understand why someone would kill themselves on a bad acid trip. I was really grateful to have friends and an amazing girlfriend to keep me roped into reality. Shit could have gotten very dark if they weren't there. While this wasn't necessarily a bad trip, it had moments in it that were terrible. I literally experienced heaven and hell on this trip. It made me develop a lot more respect for LSD. While I've always had respect for psychedelics, I'll make sure to keep in mind to definitely watch the set and setting carefully next time. This was the first time I ever treated acid in a recreational setting with the intent of getting lit with my friends, thinking I could handle it all based on past experiences, and truly got my ass handed to me. Please treat acid with respect, even if you're experienced with it. Setting, and intent, these all play huge roles in how your trip will play out. It took me quite a while to type this all. It's now 5:22. The trip is reminiscent of a 200 microgram peak and fading visuals. I'm sorry for any grammatical errors. I'm high and very, very tired. The following is an Amanita Muscaria trip report, sent in by a subscriber. Hi, I'm Thomas from France, and I really appreciate your channel. It's helped me a lot, and since I don't have any friends around me experimenting with plant or mush medicine, I have no one to talk to or hear from regarding this, so thank you. Here is my report from Tuesday the 24th of October, 2023. Last Tuesday, I came back to my house in a small village after a long weekend in the city. I knew I forgot a jar outside before leaving. In it were a few Amanita caps, fresh in cold water. It was a leftover from a harvest that took ages to dry in multiple oven sessions. I didn't want to throw them away, so I decided to try a sun tea, because apparently UV would convert ibotenic acid into muscimol. I've been experimenting with Amanitas since last year's harvest. They're abundant in the forest nearby. My goal was to trip, but I started experimenting with this really special mushroom in the safest way possible. And after 10 months, I'd finished 3 big jars of dried caps without ever feeling anything, not even a buzz. But nevertheless, I had good nights and vivid dreams. So back to last Tuesday, the jar was still there. It's been cold, so I decided to consume it. I wasn't trusting that the UV would have done a good job, so I decided to boil the thing and reduce the volume. I let it simmer for about 40 minutes. Once the brew was in my cup, I added lemon juice and honey. About halfway down, I started shivering every time I was swallowing. I told myself, this is a good sign. It's going to work this time. I drank a bit more and I started to wonder if it would be a better idea to stop there, but I finished it anyway. Quickly I felt an effect like being drunk. My stomach was empty for 6 hours, and at 8 PM, 45 minutes after I ingested the tea, I went upstairs to meditate in my bed, seated against the wall, and blacked out. Did I fall asleep? The next thing I remember is slowly coming back to consciousness, but not quite in my ego in this world. I could think, this is it, this is working this time. But I had no idea why I would think that. Brain palpitations, as I call it, were hitting hard. It was like blinking really quickly, but not quite the same. Then, a dissociating sensation submersed me. It reminded me of Salvia divinorum, mixed with that feeling that you get during a K-hole, this kind presence, and the feeling that you're home. I started having a vision of a parabolic object covered with thousands of mirrors which were flipping upside down, one after the other, at every palpitation. This was super weird, and I still had no idea of what was really happening. Then, I had the strange feeling that I was getting close to the truth of all things, once every palpitations would merge into one. During that phase of increasing speed, my consciousness came back, and I remembered that I took Amanita, but wasn't quite sure where I was right now. I felt the mattress, and it reassured me, and I put trust in the process of what was unfolding. It's like something close to an orgasm, and I felt I would explode or something, or merge into another dimension entirely. I was grabbing my sheets and tightening my jaw. I wanted to make it, whatever it was. But suddenly, an urge to vomit came over me. I opened my eyes and saw the window lit up by the moon. I stood up, almost fell, and then purged twice outside. The garden itself seemed 30 meters down. The imbalance I was feeling was crazy. I could feel my body falling to the back left. I was off that brainstorm, and once I figured how to balance out, I wanted to go downstairs to the bathroom. The staircase is pretty steep, so I was really careful. But once I was at the bottom, I realised I couldn't feel my body moving, even during really fast movements. No muscle pain whatsoever. The time distortion was really something to behold. I could go full Flash Gordon mode, and it actually made me laugh. But I thought about what I just went through, and I decided to go back to my bed to meditate, curious on what I would feel next. I realised upon grabbing my phone that it was now 3 AM, and this was a shocking revelation. Did all the other tries of Amanita peak when I was asleep? And this one woke me up because I needed to puke, I wondered. I couldn't believe how messed up I was 7.5 hours in. I tried to unlock my phone without success, and during that, I started completely dissociating from my body. My awareness itself seemed to emanate from above my left shoulder. I couldn't feel my body whatsoever, but I could intervene at any time I wanted. It was quite pleasant being 50% out of my body and 50% in. I sat cross-legged with my back against the wall and started breathing deeply. Nothing noticeable in terms of vision. I was still half dissociated. But then, my arms started moving by themselves or by some kind of force that I could feel in my hands. I decided to trust it, and then, time slowed down a lot. I was amazed by this. My arms were moving up and down in slow motion, completely out of my control. Suddenly, it's like inviting me up to some kind of a dance. I let myself go without intervening, thinking it got to heal my neck and shoulder pain. I mean, why not? I was shaking and moving really fast, as the flow of time suddenly came back to normal. I started chanting and hyperventilating. Again, I could have stopped it at any time, but I was really curious to experience it. I had no idea what I was saying. It was like a shaman trance and ended with banging my head against the mattress, still hyperventilating. Then, it all stopped on empty lungs. I held my breath and told myself, why is it making me do a Wim Hof? Or is it me? Or it? As I was just dissociated before, it could have been a spirit. Anyway, after a few breath holds, I felt really tired and could feel my body falling asleep, but my awareness itself was slowly drifting to the top right of my sight. I thought I was about to be conscious in the unconscious. The drift out was really slow, and it felt like a tutorial or something, but any time I swallowed my saliva, it was taking me right back into my body. I had multiple tries, and I could hear voices teaching me the whole time. Unfortunately, I fell asleep at some point. The dreams I had after this were crazy real and coloured, and utterly insane in what was happening in them. I'm not ready to put that into words right now. I woke up pretty alright, although a bit worried about those 6 to 7 hours of blackout, and I didn't tell you that I pissed my bed during this whole time. All in all, this was a very intense experience, and I do wish someone was around for it. But at the same time I sort of don't, because I would have alarmed anyone during the trance, dance and chanting stage. It's really important to brew tea from as many dried caps as you can, as the concentration of the compounds varies quite a lot. It really was a mistake for me to brew 7 fresh caps. I do not recommend this whatsoever. Be safe, out and in there. Totalito. Oh rats, it's deceiving. A Datura trip report by the Pie-Eyed Piper, posted to earwid.org September 1st, 2006. September 10th, 2005. Datura inoxia. 2 pods each, freshly picked. Each pod containing over 200 seeds. My boyfriend, £170, and I, £145, ate them in the early evening, and got really tired when it set in. Both fell asleep for a couple hours. I woke to find him looking under the baseboard heater with a mag light. He'd found a bunch of pills under there, but some of them weren't real, because they dematerialised when you picked them up. He also told me that our pet rat Baldwin, God bless your little tail, wherever you are, had found some other rats, but some of them looked sick, so I had to put them in the cage to keep them from contaminating anybody. Baldy was a free-range hairless rat. I looked, and sure enough, I saw 2 or 3 rats and a little black mouse in the cage. Then I noticed 2 more sleeping by the alarm clock. There were more burrowing through the laundry hamper, making the whole thing squirm around like crazy. Now, one of the important things to remember about any kind of Jimson weed is that a lot of the time that I'm high, I don't even know that I'm totally insane. It's like I forgot I took anything, and it seems perfectly natural for the world to suddenly appear like it does. Well, we came down a bit and discerned that the sick rats were a paper towel, as well as a sock, some newspaper, etc., and we had a good laugh about it. September 11th, 2005. In this hallucinogenic garden of our eccentric neighbour also grew Datura stramonium. Unlike the beautiful inoxia, it had no semen scented, no kidding, white trumpets, and instead of the smooth leaves and less spiky pods, the plants were scraggly with worm-eaten pointy leaves, dark, flowerless, and the pods wore armour like so many hypodermic needles. I had to wear a glove to twist them off and scoop out the seeds. It looked pretty evil for a plant, and the seeds were more abundant per pod, smaller and darker, and tasted like battery acid as we chomped down at least 700 seeds apiece at about 8 AM. That, as you'll soon note, is far too much. Both C and I are very experienced with tripping. I started with acid and mushrooms at 13 and loved it. Then I went on to love peyote, mescaline, DXM, AMT, DMT, all the way to toad skins and Brazilian tree bark. Nothing could have prepared us for this one though. Again, we fell asleep, and once again, I woke second. This time C was talking on the phone to his mum on a screwdriver in the middle of the kitchen floor, surrounded by the inner workings of the coffee pot, trying to inject a spoonful of tobacco and smoking a butter knife, begging his mum on the screwdriver and I for a glass of water. Datura lets us confuse one object of even slightly similar size, shape, weight or personality with another object, often with strange results. I noticed the rats were back and mentioned it to C. He said yes. They'd come home about an hour ago and were seemingly in worse health than even before. In the cage was a rather gruesome sight. A white big shaved mother rat had been hit by a car or something and was all ripped apart on the back half, with a spine hanging out. In reality though, this was the hole in the sock one puts the foot in. I could tell by her laboured breathing that she was in agony. I did all I could do to hold back the tears while I begged C to put it out of its misery, as she gave birth to litter after litter of rotting, stillborn pinkies. This brought the maggots and flies, even some huge spiders. All those cliché tripping stories were coming true, but by then, we had no idea we were schizo, and forgotten that we had even taken anything. That Jimson weed could convince 2 adults of non-existent rats not once, but twice in 24 hours. We didn't know how, since we always kept the place tidy. That we ended up with such a pest problem was quite a bizarre thing. It was hard to keep track of how many people were in the apartment as well. Most of them I didn't even know. We agreed that the 2 smelly fishermen who had just left would not be allowed back in. I told the fan not to answer the door, and she said she'd give me a shot of dope, since there was all this coke piled sky high on the table, and I just couldn't get my dealer to listen to me to give me anything, or to pay attention to me when he was so small. He was so uncooperative that the more and louder I yelled at him, the smaller and more deformed he became, until I finally realised that he was a potato in the palm of my hand. The potatoes had pushed off the table by all the coke, and this immense jet-black hulk of a man weighing it out in featherweights. Nah, not potatoes. How could someone be so cruel as to cut off a rat's tail and arms and legs like that? I guess they weren't all dying though, because they were all still breathing and moving, and had many scars but no open wounds or blood. The old man and old woman in our bed were dying though. The woman had a bottle of Oxyfast. I told her I needed some as was dope sick, but she said I'd get no sympathy from her, even after all I was doing for them. She and her husband were so sick and dying I felt bad. and I let them boss me around in my own house so rudely, making me brush the teeth for them, cook, and bring them soup made of Datura seeds and lotion, ice water, and cold compresses. I ended up shaving her legs with one piece of the inside of that Mr. Coffee that would never work again. The piece itself looked something like a razor. As I said, that would be a common mistake on this stuff. The landlord must have found out about the vermin because by the looks of all the people taking cover in the trash cans outside, they were going to smoke us out. C was on probation at the time with less than a week left, so either the cops or the landlord or the fire department or someone, C said, was going to fumigate us in a second. He put a pair of jeans on, then he put on another pair over those. I told him he had two, and he took one off again. He said hurry, and I said I couldn't move. I lay on the floor a little beat up, a blackish eye and split brow and lip. C had wanted to get me out of me, wanted to know where I'd hidden myself. "What did you do with Elle? I know she's in there," or something to that effect. Obviously no hard feelings about this. He didn't remember it, and I barely can either, but I had marks for a week or so. I couldn't move because I most likely had a concussion, so I told him to go on without me. Save yourself. Save yourself from the cops and poor Baldwin the rat, the only real rat in the place, from the pest control army that was now advancing on us from the front of the house, running hoses under the doors. You see the hoses flapping around with the pressure of the gas inside, hissing like snakes and whispering jumbled warnings and laughing at us. C put Baldwin on his shoulder and, no shirt, no belt, no socks, jumped out the window and down the fire escape. That was the last time we ever saw our beloved pet. A moment of sad silence. More and more people kept coming to my house. They'd usually knock on the door and I'd open it, and once I did, I couldn't get rid of any of them, even when I said I had to leave to go look for C, because hallucinations are just so damn uncooperative. You can't even physically remove them from your living room when your hand goes right through them. It's nuts. There was this little Quasimodo-looking albino girl that I might have gone to school with in the hamper now, and she was getting eaten alive by the rats and maggots. I had to get ready and find a ride to the party. I met one girl, Jamie, who was homeless and on the road like I used to be. She also carried baby wipes in a satchel for when she couldn't get a shower, which she asked me for, and I felt bad refusing her, but I simply had to get everybody out so I could go find C. C, who took my morphine and supposedly went out to lunch with a bunch of girls and one of my ex-boyfriends from a long time ago, and would show up at the party and better not have given away my morphine by the time I got there. Jamie and I talked very closely for a while though, and found out we had a lot in common, even though she was dead, and I was just on a different plane of existence entirely. We could still smoke a joint together, and so we did in the bathroom. Then she packed up her bag, gave me a straight-through hologram hug, and utterly disappeared. We lived next to a supermarket. I went over there to see if anyone in the parking lot had seen C with my morphine, or had any morphine for that matter. Boy, am I lucky I didn't get arrested. I found out the party was closer than I thought. It was to be held almost right behind my house down by the railroad tracks. They were using the supermarket parking lot for the overflow. It was full of low-flying bats, birds, and tiny dinosaur-like things, all white or albino. I talked to the ATM machine. The automatic teller automatically told me all kinds of nonsense. Back at home, waiting for C and my non-existent morphine, I could see them all setting up the tents and getting the stages ready for the party, for the big show. It was practically standing room only out there. People, I believe, of all shapes and sizes and styles of dress were present, even some top hats and monocles, bustles and hoop skirts, as well as crazy African stuff and stilts. I doubted the humanness of some entities, including some with more than one head, but never doubted their reality. I was starting to get upset now though. Not so much about the pills, but I was worried about C. It was getting dark now, and I walked away from the carloads and truckloads of people that were pointing at me, talking about me like, "Wow, what is that?" Now, it was just me and the ghost of Tommy Irving, someone I knew who had died just a couple months ago. I'd been asking questions from a telephone pole when he came up behind me and told me it wasn't going to talk back, but that I could talk to him if I wanted, like if I ever needed anyone to talk to about stuff. A little nicer than he usually was in real life. We walked and talked all the way down the street to the garden where we picked the pods. And then, almost 12 hours later, I then remembered that I took the Datura and that I'd been tripping this whole time. The road was flapping like a magic carpet. I could see animals and eyes and faces everywhere. Timmy said if we, as in me and C, were both tripping on the nightshade on the same night but at different places, I should be able to find him eventually. So, I closed my eyes and called to him. We are very close, not only in our relationship, but as tripping partners as well. We've often had mass hallucinations or communicated without speaking, so I had no doubt it would work. And then, he appeared in the Jimsonweed garden, kind of fading in and out like TV with bad reception. It was hard to see him, and it took all my energy just to get through long enough for Timmy to disappear, and for C to look at me with grave seriousness and say, "Find out if I have bail, now." So I knew he was in jail. He'd got arrested for allegedly going in the Thai restaurant, asking to drink the fish tank water and eat the fish itself, and then continuing on to Turner Street, climbing into the back seat of an unlocked car, and sitting there talking to the headrest until the police showed up. While he was in there, he thought it was me and his mum in the car, driving us all to this party. In the end though, they dropped the charges after he said he'd accidentally eaten a poisonous plant and was just temporarily loony. I was crazy for about 2 to 3 days altogether, before all the posters finally stopped talking to each other, and I could no longer see that design in the carpet or ceiling that was squirming around anymore. Altogether, this may sound like a bad trip, but I wouldn't say it was entirely. It was too big of a dose and not the right setting, of course, and had the plants been more mature, we may well have kicked the bucket. I've tried it again twice more since anyways. The stramonium is stronger than the inoxia by far, though the inoxia gives a worse dry mouth and difficulty swallowing, unless I was just too high on the stramonium to notice anything. The visuals can tend to lean towards the gruesome and grotesque, but I think it's just a chemical, because I've heard the same from just about anyone that's ever done this stuff. This is not where I want to be right now. An alcohol, cannabis, and salvia divinorum trip report, posted by Foolish Freshman to earwid.org December 3rd, 2004. I'm writing this report to give a legitimate warning to anyone who might be interested in giving salvia divinorum, at 12x extract, which was what I was told after the experience, a legitimate whirl. Before I continue, I would like to let all who read this know that I'm not a foolish person regarding the use of psychedelics. I'm currently pursuing an anthropology degree, with emphasis on cultural religious practices, and I always exercise the utmost caution when practicing mind-altering substances of any kind. In the past, I've had experience of multiple different hallucinatory substances, amazing, and, of course, a small amount of dabbling in speedy powders, not quite my cup of tea. I'm writing about one particular Saturday night, when I was a freshman at my college. It was at this point I was somewhat naive in the realm of psychedelic conscious experience, and basically had no idea what salvia, the nightmare leaf, as many call it around here, had in store for me. After getting myself quite drunk at an off-campus kegger and a trip to the bar, I found myself in the company of a small group of psychonauts in a very cramped dorm room on the edge of campus. As the booze began to run dry, and the very last of our cannabis was in the process of being smoked, we realised that our night seemed to be at an end. "Not to fear," said a friend of mine. I'll call him Igby. "I have 1.5 grams of 12x salvia here. I reckon we should fire up the bong," he said. "What's salvia?" I naively asked, being unfamiliar with the drug at this point in time. "Oh, it's a psychoactive drug. It'll make you see some funky shit," Igby replied, very sketchy on the details. As the alcohol had loosened me up quite a bit, I felt that I might give it a whirl, being out of beer and cannabis. Well, this was my first mistake, folks. Salvia is not to be trifled with. I tripped on a healthy 1/8 of mushrooms prior to this several times, and I'd never experienced anything negative, so all systems were go. Next thing I know, the 4-foot glass bong was in front of me, as I was being blessed with the opportunity to spark it. Being drunk, I torched the hell out of the bong. I waited for the chamber to turn an opaque milky white, and cleared the entire thing. I started to gag on the smoke, as my lungs literally reached maximum capacity. Wow, I was certainly in for it now. Foolish bastard that I am. After exhaling, I noted a strange, not altogether pleasing, leafy taste. Not your dank cannabinoids, my friends. Not at all. Now, from this point on, let it be known that I have absolutely no concept of time, or any real perspective on the true chronology of these events, but I will articulate it as best I can. The first thing I remember noticing was a strange sort of rumbling feeling. This can be related to when I first feel a good hit of nitrous oxide coming on, the effect one would get as a roaring train rolls by a room, causing everything to tremble and shake. The next thing I realised, everything had become unreal, as if in a dream. I looked up at the wall and there was this strange sort of membrane-like structure that was looming over. Suddenly, it fell down upon me. It was almost as though I was being spun into a sort of cocoon-like thing, seemingly out of nothing. My first reaction was complete and utter disbelief. I'd completely forgotten that I had taken any substance whatsoever, and essentially, I didn't know what the hell was going on. I tried to make out my friends' faces for comfort, and I was utterly aghast to see the entire room, and everything that encompassed it, including my friends themselves, were growing in size, as if coming near me. Suddenly, the entire room, or reality, or whatever the hell it was, passed right through me, and off in the distance, I perceived another reality, the same one as before with my friends sitting in a room hitting the bong. This sort of Polaroid type thing grew and grew again, until it passed by me once more, only to be followed by the same thing over and over again, as if in some form of demented flashback cycle. It was by now that I was in a complete panic. I'd lost all control of my limbs, as the cocoon, I know it sounds fucked up, was being spun around my entire body, pinning me to the ground. For some reason, I made the assumption at this point that the police were there. I have no idea why I came to this thought. It's just bad tripping, or some form of it, I suppose. I thought they were going to take me away. I shouted out to my friends to help me, but what came out of my mouth was perceived by my ears as an unintelligible mess of broken up syllables. I'm not necessarily talking about auditory hallucinations and octave changes like an LSD or mushroom experience. It really was as if my voice was a track on a CD player that was skipping rapidly. So rapidly, in fact, that I could not understand what I or anyone else in the room was saying. Now, here's where things get really crazy. The room itself keeps passing by me faster and faster and faster, as the cycle or frame thing seems to be speeding up. I started to hear this strange, deep, ominous humming noise as though we were about to jump to hyperspeed in a starship of some sort. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, everything broke apart. It was as though my mind could not handle what was going on in reality, and the cycle itself tore apart violently. Pretend everything in your field of vision is a Polaroid picture. Try and imagine it ripping off section by section, over and over again. This is what it was like. Underneath this all was the most complete and utter blackness that I have ever seen. I don't even feel as though I was seeing it, as much as simply being it. I was nothing for a moment, and then I fell. This here now is the most abstract, insane thing that I have ever experienced in my entire life. Once my reality tore open, the cocoon membrane thing suddenly ripped apart, and I felt like I was falling and twisting, turning violently into, well, something. Who the hell knows? I just distinctly remember falling violently, as if down a cliff, hitting every single boulder on the way down. As I hit the bottom, I honestly thought I had broken every bone in my body. I don't want to give the impression that I felt pain, because at that point, I really don't think I could have felt much of anything. It was more so that once I hit the bottom, my body was dead, and for the first time in my existence, there was nothing. There was simply this strange, abstract consciousness that wasn't necessarily me anymore. As I, or my new manifestation, whatever it was, I sat there, remembered seeing a blinding orb of light directly above me. It was fractalizing and turning and twisting. I thought it was my world, and that I had left it, and was never to be allowed back. There was no sadness, no pain, nothing. Just nothing. Never in my life have I ever felt so existential. And it was then, from all sides of the orb, that these cosmic beings, about 5 of them, all looked down at me in disbelief. At first, I thought they were aliens, and I had been taken to them. Then, I recognized the face of Igby, and all the others. It was as if I had just returned from the land of Oz. Although, that being said, Oz would have certainly been more appealing than wherever it was I had been. As I sat up, I was completely shaken, but very glad to be back. Apparently only 10 minutes had passed in real time, and according to Igby, I was laying down for the whole thing, mumbling gibberish to myself and not blinking at all. I'm not sure about the whole not blinking thing, but then again, who knows? I certainly don't. I'm not trying to make this experience out to be anything more than it is. It was mine, and that's why it's important to me. None of this is exaggerated. In fact, there's shitloads of other stuff I'm sure I neglected to mention. Anyways, for what it's worth, I've never done salvia again. Because, well, I'm profoundly frightened that I will never come back from it. Be careful with this plant, and if you choose to take the definitive bong rip as I did, well, just... I don't even know. But just please, be in a padded room or something. Peace. Interdimensional Alien Contact, an LSD trip report by HP, posted to earwid.org March 29, 2017. Setting: New England, Australia. Mindset: apprehensive but open-minded. Had previous high-dose LSD experiences twice in the month prior to the trip that had been very thought-provoking and strange. It was Christmas Eve, and my partner and I had decided to spend it away from our families and closer to nature. We'd travelled out of town to our favourite spot. It was a hot summer's day, but you could feel in the air that in the afternoon we would have a thunderstorm. The area we were in was beautiful. It was mostly open pastures nestled between the mountains, and there were very few people around. Creeks, rivers and brooks weaved the valley floor, and we spent most of the morning exploring indigenous sites in the surrounding valleys. We had lunch at the local pub and a few beers before dropping the acid in the early afternoon. These were by far the strongest tabs I've ever had, and I cannot even guess what the dose actually was. But one of these tabs was enough to catapult me towards another reality. Prior to tripping, I had some reservations about the coming weather. The clouds were looming large and thunder was echoing in the distance. However, common sense was outweighed by a desire to dive deeper into hyperspace. Previous experiences with this batch of tabs had yielded vivid, Aztec-like sacred geometries that I've experienced simply by using cannabis, maybe some lingering HPPD, but either way, it's quite pleasant. As we dosed up and rolled out the picnic blanket, we sat watching some cattle graze in an adjacent field. I checked my phone and sure enough, the icons began to merge and morph and dance on the screen. This is it, I thought. As the trip really started to accelerate, I had a feeling that I was heading into an alien unknown. It was at this point the storm began. A light rain fell, and for the most part it was pleasant. But as the acid kept increasing in intensity, the rain became more of a menace. Eventually the rain picked up, and we, having no shelter besides a small tent, decided to sit in the car and wait it out. It was hardly an ideal place to trip. I sat in the car and watched the cattle unfazed by the storm. I had hoped that the storm would pass. We would be able to sit outside as the damp air and hot weather had made the car somewhat of a sauna. However, the rain increased in intensity, and I sat there thinking, here they come, feeling as though a presence was breaking through reality to try and make contact with us. My visuals at first were of closed eye only. These small black squares had started to appear and spin rapidly, forming complex geometric patterns. They seemed to invite me to follow them, and I refused. Instead, focusing on other things and steering the closed eye visuals. Failing to shake the black squares, I opened my eyes and stared at the rain falling on the windshield. The rain slowly became overtaken by this pattern, a common experience we had both had staring at our bathroom wall whilst tripping. The pattern was a cobweb-like image that becomes apparent particularly on textured surfaces on moderate doses of LSD. It appears to spread centrally from the visual field in a T-like configuration, and prolonged focusing on the pattern tends to increase its intensity, and slowly it will begin to spread and fill the visual field entirely, interacting with the surrounding environment as well. This pattern, for me, is associated with information being transferred. So it was at this point I was seeing the pattern, then those little black squares became apparent in the raindrops and they began to align along the vertices of the pattern itself. It was by now that my partner was enjoying watching the cows whilst I was fighting back a complete breakdown of my reality. I knew the experience was becoming too intense for me to resist, so I just decided to go with it. And after a while I felt the intensity drop slightly, and I became more comfortable with the headspace I was currently in. The pattern persisted, but the pulling sensation from the squares had stopped. In fact, they seemed to have retreated. But it was by now that the body high was becoming intense. I felt hot, thirsty, and my whole body itself felt like it was glowing. As we'd been tripping for about an hour or two now, we decided to smoke a J at what we estimated was the peak of the experience. Previous experiences with J's and acid have resulted in an electrified feeling with synesthesia, as well as colour splitting, increased 3D open-eyed visuals, amongst other things. We were very keen right now to replicate these effects and observe them in further detail. The rain was still pouring, but the car was becoming uncomfortable, so we suited up in the most rainproof clothing we had on hand, none of which bar one raincoat was actually weatherproof. That being said, we had hit our tripping stride and took it all as part of the fun. We set out with Jay in hand to smoke by the river and enjoy the ensuing light show. Basically, from here on out, the rain just continued to increase in its intensity. Once we'd found a nice tree to stand under, we lit our little dude up and happily blazed it while staring into the bushland. Now, this is where things get weird. I started to see the pattern again, so I asked my partner what they were seeing. They described to me that they were seeing the bathroom wall pattern spreading out over everything. I told them that I saw the same thing. Then in the centre of the pattern, an icosahedron or hexagon-like shape began to emerge, and it was spinning and covered itself in Aztec patterns. I described it to them, and they reported seeing the exact same thing. Fascinated by the shared visual experience, we kept discussing the pattern and the shape we were seeing. At this point, I felt as though we'd entered some kind of Goosebumps episode. Two kids sneaking out, smoking weed, seeing this alien object. This thought really stuck in my mind and basically consumed my reality from here on out. As we observed the visual phenomena together, I noticed that the shape had begun replicating, and it was now forming a grid. If you search an icosahedron grid, you'll see some similar depictions of what we saw. My partner also reported seeing this grid emerge. We kept relaying to each other our experience and what we were observing, and the grid appeared to expand infinitely in all directions through the earth and up into the sky. Both of us recognised the grid. We both recognised that we stood on sections of it, and continued to confirm what we were both observing. As we continued to examine the visual phenomena we were experiencing, we both saw a black square emerge from the centre of a section of the grid. I asked my partner what they made of it, and they just said that it was everything. All religion, all life, all beliefs, all things. And I confirmed that was the same impression I was getting. Pretty spooky. It's by now that I had a flash where I could see a torus with lights ascending and descending it. It was a representation of the cycle of life and death, and the infinite nature of existence and consciousness. As the flash passed, the black square became much larger, and formed a tunnel at this point. So we decided to move on, because we were both getting really tripped out, and felt like we were being beckoned by the grid. We also realised that we were soaked from the rain and should probably find shelter by now. As we turned to walk back along the road to the campsite, I observed the grid in the sky, but in the sky, between two mountains, there was a large icosahedron. It stood out of the grid and took on the significance of its own in my mind. On this return walk, things became more and more intense. The pooling water on the ground was glowing green, blue and magenta. It appeared these three colours were being projected off everything around us and were streaming into our very bodies. The colours were made up of small packets of hollow squares that spun in response to external sounds. It was then that I felt as if we were being followed by something. I had this unshakable feeling that there was this object floating above us, a bit like that green spinning gem from The Sims or something along those lines, and it was trying to communicate something to us. We headed back to the campsite and took shelter under a pagoda. I was now in full trip mode, teetering on the edge of reality itself. We stood holding each other, trying to look as straight as possible. We both felt as though we were ascending, that we were about to take off land and go somewhere else entirely, and by now, I had completely bought into my alien abduction narrative, piecing together the puzzle that we had found ourselves in. We had gone camping in bad weather conditions, ill-prepared, dressed inappropriately, and had taken psychedelics. I thought to myself, maybe this is it. This is how you exit our reality. This is what must happen to those couples that report being abducted. This idea less than impressed my partner, and I'd completely shit on their trip and spun them into this negative space. As for me though, well, I was completely convinced that we were about to be abducted by aliens. Behind my head I could feel them. Felt as though sharp surgical instruments were probing my mind. Crunching, grinding sounds were filling my skull, and I could even smell DMT. I felt bubbles travelling my spine, right through the back of my neck. I closed my eyes, and the tunnel that I had seen smoking DMT suddenly appeared, and peering through was this odd face. The rising tones and high-pitched ringing set in, and I felt that same beckoning feeling once more. I resisted it though. I didn't want to go, even though I really did. I knew that if I went with it, I would collapse. I was already freezing cold and soaking wet. There were other campers around, and I'd draw too much attention to myself if I would just collapse here and now. Besides, the only explanation I'd be able to offer for my present condition would be aliens, and that would surely end with a trip to the emergency department. My partner was now quite concerned, and suggested we move elsewhere. We returned to our tent to lie down, but found it flooded. To me, this was another synchronistic sensation. They wanted us to go with them. My partner, despite how scared they later told me they were, handled all of this really well. We ended up back in the car in our underwear, drying ourselves out and trying to survive. In the car, we continued to have these incredible visions of the grid, as well as of eternity of life, death, and rebirth. But eventually, after nearly 8 hours of insanity, I finally felt the ability to sleep. So when the rain stopped, we went back to the tent and began a long spiral back to Earth. Some of the other sensations experienced through this trip involved complete dissociation with reality, a sense of lost time, and a very real sense that reality was a projection of the mind. I felt as if me and my partner were somehow one, that we shared a reality and a destiny, that everything was an illusion, that we could ascend to become part of the grid, as well as consciousness being eternal in nature, somehow linked to the grid itself. Well, I must say, this was a very long and strange trip indeed. Poison Tea. A Datura trip report. Posted by Metal to Irwood.org, May 29th, 2002. In my quest for self, for centeredness, I have made a few wrong turns, a few blunders along the way, but none were quite as serious as this one. Datura, Angel's Trumpet. This was my selection for consciousness expansion one day. Several leaves were placed in a pot. They were boiled in a small quantity of water. The tea was nutty and earthy, as described in other accounts I had read in my research beforehand. About 15 minutes after my 4-ounce cup of tea, my memory stops. I came to the next day in intensive care. I was strapped down to the bed, still hallucinating. 10 to 15 minutes after drinking the tea, my speech became slurred and I was unable to walk. I sat down on my friend's bed. I leaned against the wall, and everything from here on is what I've been told, as I have absolutely no recollection of the events. I sat there, my condition slowly degrading, fading in and out of consciousness. The more attentive of the two friends in the room checked my heart rate and breathing often, to make sure I was okay. I muttered a lot of things that didn't make any sense. I smoked many an imaginary cigarette and scratched madly at my skin. I eventually slipped under and didn't wake up. My temperature steadily rises, and then D and T decide to call my roommate, who then calls my father. After this, I'm driven to an emergency room, and somewhere along the way, I regain consciousness. I continue to smoke my imaginary cigarette, and I mutter to myself. I had this cold stare, and I would look through people without recognizing them. At the hospital, I became violent. I assume that this is because they were attempting to put an IV in my arm, or something equally unpleasant, and I, in my hallucinating state, didn't take kindly to it. After taking several clumsy swings at the doctor, my father punched me in the forehead hard enough to knock me back onto the bed, where I was quickly strapped down. Shortly after this, I went into respiratory arrest. My clothes were cut off me to facilitate the nurses. My memory starting up again does not coincide with waking up. I simply start remembering what was. I was fighting with all my strength against my bonds. The nurse would ask me to stop, and I would comply, but then forget and resume my struggle. I saw ants crawling all over the far wall, and wouldn't believe the nurse when she told me there was nothing there. I begged for her to untie me so I could go look for myself, but she wouldn't. The ceiling rippled whenever I looked at it. Spots on the wall grew legs and walked around as huge spiders. I caught myself talking to people who were neither in the room nor the state itself several times, and there were moments of total lucidity sandwiched between these hallucinations. I had an IV in my arm, a tube in my nose, a catheter, which was none too comfortable, and band-aids all over from various injections. After a couple of days and several psychiatrists later, I was permitted to go home. My eyes, they're still dilated. My chest, it hurts from fighting these straps, the straps that have secured me. I'm riddled with needle holes and completely lacking physical strength. I'm left with the same nagging questions about life, as well as thousands of dollars in hospital bills, and now, most of my family and friends think that I'm completely out of my mind for drinking this poisonous tea. I had intentionally consumed very little, going by a guide another user of Datura had posted, but apparently my own biochemistry differs from his own. Death was not the object of the game, and if it isn't what you're after, stay far, far away from the devil's trumpet. Know what you're afraid of. A 10-gram solo mushroom trip report by Tommy's Planet, posted to the Psychonauts subreddit 6 years ago. A quick disclaimer here. I know how dumb I was during this trip report, but know that this took place quite a while ago. My experiences with these substances have changed me in many ways, and I have nothing but respect for them now. I honestly can't decide how I feel about this trip. Part of me thinks it was a horrible mistake, and another part appreciates the information I gained from it. First of all, I broke many of the tripping rules, which already makes me an idiot. At this point in time, I'd tripped 20 times with friends, and this was the third time doing it alone. I had positive experiences with those. Originally, I was going to dose 5 grams of dried shrooms. However, on the day, I decided I was going to double the dose. This was due to me wanting to go deeper. I I had previously tried 7 grams, and that was a glorious experience. I was going to start with 7 grams, and by hour 2, I'd dosed the other 3G. Due to past experience, I arrogantly believed that I could handle it all. I'd planned the entire trip out, music playlist, decked out my room to trip in, and wrote down all my goals for the trip. I even had glow sticks. It was 10:30 PM when I decided to dose, and during the onset and come up, I hung out with my guinea pig and prepared some food for the peak. I ended up going with watermelons. After 15 to 20 minutes, I was seeing layers of geometric patterns all over my room. Multiple layers all on top of each other. I was enamoured by their sheer beauty. I then proceeded to listen to some music and close my eyes. The closed-eye visuals were out of this world. The next few parts I completely blanked out. I remember looking at the clock and seeing that it was 12 AM. I was shocked by this because I didn't realise how much time had already passed. Even more unusual was the fact that I didn't feel how long that amount of time felt at all. It didn't feel like time had passed quickly or slowly. Time didn't mean much of anything. I know this doesn't make much sense, but even months after the experience, I'm finding it quite hard to articulate. So I then ate the rest of the mushrooms and smoked a bowl of weed. After a while, I continued to listen to music and try to have a good time. This is where the trip took a horrific turn. I started thinking about my future. I started to delve into the negative, thinking of myself as a failure and that I wasn't good enough at all. In my mind, I was envisioning a future where I was a homeless failure, all alone with no one in the world. In my mind, I saw no other way where my life could lead me, and it genuinely horrified me. The visuals at this point covered my entire field of vision. I could no longer tell the closed-eye visuals from the opened-eye ones. They all just blended together, and I couldn't possibly begin to describe what they looked like now. I was getting really bad vibes, and the only thing I thought to do was to lie on the floor, curled up in the fetal position, which to be honest is probably the worst thing I could have done. Over the next couple of hours, all I remember was me repeating the words, "I'm doomed. It's over. It's over." Felt the most scared I've felt in my entire life. It was truly terrifying. I believe this continued on for a couple hours, although I don't remember. I blanked out fully at this point. So after some more time passed, I started to forget why I thought I was a failure. After that, all my memories had dissolved. I had zero access to any of them. I couldn't remember who I was, and all I knew was I was a failure and that I wasn't good enough for anybody. This made me feel absolutely horrible. After a while of this, I started to become lucid. A voice in my head appeared and told me to get up. So, of course, I obeyed it. It was a struggle though, as all my joints felt winded up and I had this massive body load going on, which obviously hindered my movement. However, this had gotten me out of my nightmare, and I remembered that a way to get out of a negative headspace would be to change the location. So there I went, and wandered into the room next to mine where I kept my guinea pig. Seeing things that were familiar to me grounded me entirely. I was finally starting to remember. It was 3:30 AM now. I started to relax and actually started to turn the experience around. But funnily enough, as soon as I started to relax, I projectile vomited. Luckily I made it to my bin, so there was no mess. I remember the sick kept coming and coming. Sorry, I know that's gross. A short time passed and I began to think that maybe I'd actually tricked myself into thinking I was throwing up. Although the smell shot down that fury soon after. The clock read 4 AM and I came to the conclusion that I needed some sleep. The body high I got was quite pleasant. I then played with some glow sticks and the traces were awesome and watched the visuals fade away. This trip really taught me a lot of things about myself. It showed me what I was afraid of and more. It wasn't instantly beneficial, but I'm still integrating the information months after the experience. It really helped me get to the root of a lot of my problems, ranging from insecurities, low self-esteem, and a lack of self-confidence. The fact that I eventually got myself out of it and managed to pull it together actually gave me a strange sense of empowerment, though it did take me long enough. Before this trip, I've had difficult and bad experiences, but nothing can compare to this one. This and a previous trip woke me the fuck up. These compounds demand respect, and I can guarantee that I learnt my lesson. Heroic doses require a trip sitter. This trip showed me what I was afraid of. Not in the sense of being scared of spiders or anything, but the true demons that we all have. So I continue to trip around once a month, and I'm planning many more experiences for the future. I hope you guys enjoyed reading my nightmare trip. Ego Death Nightmare. An experience with Allad and cannabis. Posted by Anonymous to earwid.org, March 7th, 2018. I'm on mobile and I'm writing this a few days after the experience, so forgive me for any errors. This is the most insane and traumatic experience I've ever had. It was a nice Monday morning. I'd eaten a healthy breakfast, cleaned up around the house, to reassure a healthy set and setting. I prepared everything I would need beforehand. Music, food, water, various games, etc. And I felt really great. Thought I was prepared for an intense trip. I'd only tripped once before on Allad, 1 week previously. I figured 450 micrograms was fine because I took 300 micrograms and felt nothing for almost 4 hours. Took another tab and had minor effects. This time I decided to start at 450 micrograms to see where that would get me. I decided to trip alone, as I wasn't uncomfortable doing it before. My mum was the only other person in the house, but I was confident I wouldn't be seeing her. Also, no benzos on hand, so I was strapped in. And let me tell you, I'm never tripping without them again after this. At 0 hours, about 11:30, I placed 3 tabs under my tongue, left them there until dissolved, and decided to take a shower. 25 minutes in, I was done showering and dressed at this point. I began to feel a little bit of stomach discomfort, so I laid in bed to meditate. 40 minutes in, and I'm definitely coming up at this point. Starting to see things clearer and beginning to lose some of my peripheral vision. No visuals yet besides that. I feel very happy and excited for a good trip. Right now, I think it's a good idea to smoke some bud to help with my stomach and body load. Also to kickstart the visuals a bit. Note, it took me more than 3 hours to fully come up during my last trip, so I wasn't expecting such a quick transition. I also had little to no tolerance from the weed, as I only smoke on rare occasions. It's hard to keep track of time from this point on. Things were moving very quickly, and I'll only be able to give you a very rough estimate. 55 minutes in, and I'm beginning to feel anxious from the weed. And I'm coming up very quickly now. I start to hear a high-pitched ringing in both ears. This persists until the end of the trip, growing in intensity throughout. Visuals kicking in, and hard too. HD vision is in full effect and everything is very colourful. Breathing and morphing is everywhere I look, but no traces or fractals yet, which were prominent in my first trip. I decide to put some music on to help me relax a bit. Letters and numbers on my monitor are seemingly stretched across the screen, and I quickly realise it's too difficult to use a computer. I try randomly clicking songs to see if I could find something good. I'm definitely worried at this point. Feel like I'm beginning to lose control of the trip. I try and remind myself I'm on psychedelics and that I should not struggle to control the trip, and just instead go with the flow. 1 hour and 15 minutes in and shit starts to hit the fan. Trying to find something comfortable to watch or listen to is a very difficult task. The ringing in my ears was getting louder and louder as well, beginning to get unbearable. At this point, I begin seeing things almost impossible to describe. Without any warning, My monitor starts to display geometrical patterns and fractals that quickly begin to warp across the screen. Now, this did not feel like a psychedelic hallucination. It looked as if someone was playing a YouTube video on my monitor. I was not getting these visuals elsewhere, and in my mind I was no longer in this reality and was instantly terrified. Some powerful being had decided I was naive, and to punish me. It was going to show me a reality I was never ever prepared for. At an unknown time after this, it's hard to remember exactly what happened at this point, as my thoughts were racing from before, and the world faded away. Everything was melting into each other, and any reference of reality quickly disappeared. My vision consisted of these geometrical, tessellating patterns. The one I most prominently remember is a bird's eye view of these dark brown pyramids that tessellated across my entire view. These pyramids quickly circled around from right to left. I'd lost all connection to my body at this point. There was no physical stimuli, and all I could comprehend were these pyramid shapes I was experiencing. I suddenly find myself looking out into a desert landscape. The sand is a darkish brown, and bits of foliage are scattered around the location. In the distance, I can see large mountains taking up much of the background. I can also sense a very intense negative energy behind me, as if I was standing in the same room with Super Mecha Hitler times 1,000,000. I could feel it staring at me with an intense feeling of hatred. I didn't want to turn around, and I couldn't. I was petrified. All I could think is, whatever you do not turn around. From everything else, I remember this most vividly from the trip. At another unknown time, not sure when or how this happened, but at some point I returned to my body. I'm back in my room, standing up with my arms behind my head, staring at the wall. My memories quickly come back to me while I'm trying to comprehend what exactly I had just experienced. The first thing I notice is the ringing in my ears. It is much louder now, to the point of pain, making it impossible to think clearly at all. The room lost much of its colour, and visuals now take shapes of strange-looking eye patterns across every surface. Everything was flat and geometrical. Every bit of fluidity in the room was gone. Whatever I look at oozes out evil. Inanimate objects seem to take a life of their own. Everything I look at seems to be staring right back at me. Whenever I would try to interact with something, I'd feel like it was pulling me towards it, trying to consume me. I could still hear music playing in my headphones, but it was pitch shifted and distorted so that the guitars were this hellish loud screeching, and the vocals sounded like the cries of some demonic being. I feel an intense pain in my abdomen. It feels like I'm being stabbed from the inside out. My initial thoughts were that I had died, and the room I was in was an evil recreation that I was forced to rot in for the rest of eternity. I was quite literally in hell. I couldn't leave the room because I didn't want to see my mother. I believed whatever reality I was in was false, and I couldn't stand to see it being replicated by whatever monster was doing this to me. At some point I decided to turn my computer off, which I couldn't turn back on for hours. This then puts me in a loop of trying to turn my PC on, getting too scared of getting sucked into the keyboard and monitor, laying in my bed in the fetal position trying to hide from the ceiling fan, and trying to go turn my PC on once again. Around 4 hours and 30 minutes in, I check my phone and see it's 4 AM, approximately 4 hours since I dosed. I have a moment of clarity and remember I'm on a drug. I go to the TripSit assistance chat and beg for help with what little typing I can do on the tiny phone keyboard. The chat disconnects after I lock my phone, and I cannot figure out how to get back into it whatsoever. It's then that I now believe there is no hope at all. So I cower in bed, cry, and idolize suicide for the rest of the trip. 5 hours and 30 minutes in, and I finally muster up the courage to get my computer back on. I put on Pokemon on Netflix and start to come down very quickly. After 6 hours, I'm pretty much sober at this point, but I feel very disconnected from reality and question my sobriety for the next 12 hours. My abdomen continues to hurt, but not nearly as bad, and goes away in a few hours. The ringing still persists in varying intensity 3 days later. I've got to say, this was by far the worst experience of my entire life. Do not smoke weed on the come up if you aren't experienced. I'm going to take a long break from drugs, if I ever decide to experiment with them ever again. I encourage others to respect what they put in their body, and be cautious with it. Nobody should ever have to have an experience like I did.